Hey, what's up, campers? Jayson Gaddis here with another episode of the Relationship School's Smart Couple Podcast. Campers, you ask? Exactly. That's what I call my kids, okay? I say, what's up, campers? We like to go camping. It's cute. It's endearing, guys. Relax, okay? When you have kids, you get really dorky and silly. Some of you parents know this. I think one of my favorite parts about myself is being around my children and being a total goofball with them. At some point, I got to bring them on the podcast. We'll have some fun. Okay, welcome back. Glad you're here and grateful that you are the kind of person that wants to learn about human intimacy and that you're not going to just rely on your past history and your implicit memory and the reactivity in your nervous system to just act out, right? When you get triggered and when you get upset and activated by people. Don't you think people are really challenging human beings? Man, they are. Jeez, almighty. So check this out. In this episode, I've got a guest returning for the second time. And I love this woman. She is one of our ambassadors here at the Relationship School, Alexandra Solomon. She wrote a book called Loving Bravely. If you haven't bought that and read it, I highly recommend it. Now, Alexandra, remember, is the woman who teaches Marriage 101 at Northwestern University in Chicago. And this summer, my wife and I had a chance to sit down with her in person at Northwestern and chat. And this is the first interview where Ellen joins me interviewing someone. We are on our summer sort of vacation. We hang out in the Midwest. My wife's from Chicago. And we thought it would be great to meet up with Alexandra. The only problem is the sound. I botched the sound, all right? This is a good example of it's okay to make mistakes in life, and hopefully you learn from them. If you've listened to all 207 episodes, you've noticed that there's been sound issues on maybe a handful. That's pretty good, okay? Given that the rest of them are solid. And my sound engineer and videographer, Hannah, worked really hard on this episode to get it as good as possible, and she was working with total shit, okay? Anyway, I won't get into the details, but Hannah, thank you. And she did a great job trying to clean this up, but it's still not great. But that's not Hannah, that's really me because the way we did the mics during this interview. I'm moving more and more to in-person interviews, and I still don't have it completely dialed yet. So I'm learning and growing in the process. Anyway, to the point here, this is a great interview about everything from gender to societal norms to looking into your history and your baggage and why that matters so much. And I love Alexandra's term, relational self-awareness. So, we had a very enlightening conversation both during this interview and then when we hit stop, Alexandra and Ellen and I sat and chatted for a while more, and it went even deeper. So at some point, I need to just pretend to say stop and then keep recording and then pull out some of those conversations as well. Super fruitful. Okay, I hope you enjoy this. Again, stay tuned to the action step. Stay tuned to the action step. Stay tuned to the end for your action step. And enjoy this interview and set aside the sound stuff. I trusted that you would rather have not a great sound interview and have the interview rather than to not have this interview. So I chose to I chose to give you the interview regardless. So I hope you enjoy it, and here we go. All right, welcome to the show, Alexandra Solomon and my wife, Ellen.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
So Alexandra, welcome back. Second time on the show. Psyched to have you here.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here with you guys.
Yeah, we're happy to have you.
Thanks for coming to me.
Yeah, you're in Chicago at Northwestern University where you teach. Just remind the listeners what you teach here.
Yeah, sure. So I'm a clinical assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at the university, and there are two pretty different yet related classes that I teach. So at the Family Institute at Northwestern, we have a graduate program where we train master students to be marriage and family therapists. And so I teach the intimate relations class, so getting them like ready to start working with couples. And it's sort of like this foreground, background thing where they need to become kind of like up their awareness about love and sex and conflict and relationship, and also have the skills to work with couples. So that's what that class is about. And then I teach across the street. I teach undergraduate students, basically like a relationships 101 course, building loving and lasting relationships, called Marriage 101. And we just finished up the 18th year teaching it. Wow. And that's a relational self-awareness, like love, sex, what do you need to know kind of a class. That's so much fun to teach.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, totally. And Alexandra and I talked about that in the last podcast episode, so go listen to that. I'll put the link in the show notes if you want to listen to that, listener. And today we might dive into, Ellen and I know have just curiosities about how the class is going and what are some of the themes. Mm-hmm. But I wanted to start the conversation today with your term that you use in your book, and I've heard you say many times, is relational self-awareness. Will you help us understand what that term is and why it's so important in the context of long-term partnership?
Yeah. So relational self-awareness is the term that really kind of holds together like all of the different threads of my work. So whether I'm in my role as a teacher, in my role as a clinician, in my role as a teacher, in my role as a writer, in my role as a wife and mother, like no matter where I am, that really is like the essential framework that comes with me. And it's this idea that all of our relationships, especially our romantic relationships, rest on our willingness to use ourselves as a kind of ongoing data collecting project, and view the relationship as a classroom of sorts, and that everything that's happening moment by moment within us and between us is sort of grist for the mill, and there for us to challenge ourselves, evolve ourselves, push ourselves, and that's the perspective that we need in modern times. We can talk about some reasons why I think, especially right here, right now in 2018, like there's no other way to do love based on what we want, based on the context that we're living in. Relational self-awareness has to be the essential grounding of the relationship. And so I define it as an ongoing, curious and compassionate relationship with oneself that forms the foundation of a romantic relationship.
Yeah, that's so powerful and seems so necessary if I'm in a long-term relationship or even a short-term relationship, right? I'm hearing you say in a way that it's going to be the success or the outcomes of that relationship, or the result is going to be directly related to how well I know myself. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, how well I know myself, and am I willing again and again to notice what's bubbling up within me when I share space with you. So I don't think of it as like a one-time deep dive, like 6 months of therapy, or read 2 books, or write 1 journal, and then I'm done. I think that's a great starting point, but it's ongoing, right? Because then your kids are a little older, and so then the dynamic between you guys changes based on that, or you have kids, or you move in together. So the content, because we're so dynamic, organic, unfolding, it's not a one and done. It's a constant willingness to just again and again ask that question, which is in some ways a harder, more courageous way to live, but I just don't know any other way right now. If we want our intimate relationships to have intimacy, right? This true intimacy of I'm going to show up and I want you to show up, and let's see what's possible.
Right, and aliveness and vitality to them. As I'm thinking about this idea, I'm guessing that there's some people who are naturally better at that or more on board with that than others. Do you see a difference between what conditions make someone capable of that capacity to be self-reflective and interested in their experience in an ongoing way? Or is that something people just learn to do out of necessity, or
right?
Have any ideas about that?
I think that's so interesting. I know when I think about just my college students, I think students who this is like, I'm making gross generalizations here, but my students who've had some like hardship that has taken them into therapy or some kind of recovery process, like they oftentimes, this language is really natural and organic for them. So some amount of like sort of dark night of the soul, I think I noticed that.
Yeah.
Oftentimes my students who are part of the LGBTQ plus community or the poly kink community, like whenever we kind of put ourselves on a journey or are on a journey where we're starting to question some of the main like paradigms of our culture of love, like that sort of outsider perspective where you kind of are like in a new frontier and so you have to create something from nothing, like that oftentimes is a really self-creative journey that lends itself to asking questions like, who am I? Why do I believe that? How did I come to believe that? Why do I respond to this situation in this way? Yeah. I think sometimes those students this is just like, feels like an extension of what they've been doing because they realize that the really predominant narratives of love, of sex, of relationship, like aren't going to suit them anyway. So I think that sometimes puts them on a journey that lends itself to this.
So true. So true. That seems to resonate in my experience working with teens and young people, that the ones who had to question their own life and or been through something traumatic or difficult at a young age and were grappling with that were the ones who were just more open to reflecting on themselves, sort of out of necessity. And I'm sure there's people who, that's not what has to happen in order for them to do that, but that it can be a catalyst for personal growth and development. It can be one of the positive outcomes of having to navigate something really difficult at a young age.
Yeah, and I'm curious. I'm thinking also of, I love that frame that, it's people that are naturally curious or they're forced to think outside the box because that's their unique situation. Maybe they have to come out or investigate inward. And then I'm thinking of someone maybe you've worked with where you're kind of dragging your partner into couples counseling. And I'm curious what you think creates the conditions for someone who's defensive. Becoming defensive when that's such an opportunity. Like if my wife sort of, quote, dragged me in, there'd be, just because of my nature, it's like, at least my nature now, is like, okay, yeah, where am I not showing up? Where did I drop the ball? Like a curiosity, openness to feedback in a way. Yeah. Whereas there's, people listening here that are with someone who gets defensive. Actually, there isn't a lot of openness for self-awareness or self-inquiry. Do you have any thoughts on either what creates that or why that person might be different than previous people you described?
I've been thinking a lot about, I think I'm always thinking about gender, as most of us in this work are curious about. And there are ways in which we can get super essentializing and binary in ways that aren't helpful. But I think there is something about what our culture says it is to be a quote unquote real man, right? Or sort of that that term hegemonic masculinity, sort of what our culture says is that's doing masculinity quote unquote right, the right way, tough, strong, ready to fight, don't back down, win or lose. I think some of those trappings, where you're in a culture that's this is what it is to be a man, those very same things can sometimes get in men's way of just the idea of introspection somehow has a feminine feel to it, and therefore men have been maybe taught to dismiss it, disown it, distance themselves from it, that real men don't do that. So that's one. But then I think there's a way that I sometimes feel I have as much resistance from female clients because they have been taught you are the keeper of all things relational, and so what you say goes, and that feelings equal truth, and that I'm just sharing my feelings. So I feel with women it's oftentimes helping them craft yes, feelings are data points, and then let's talk about what it is to be effective with your data point. So I think there's different Achilles heels sometimes that are based on how our culture just does these ridiculous things around girls are and boys are and women are and men are. It creates different blind spots. Sure. And I know I'm doing this because not because those are necessarily the ones that
Yeah, and I agree with what you're saying. Yeah. Male conditioning, I know just from firsthand experience. The box I felt I agreed to and was put in was pretty thick. that was one of the things on my own self-awareness journey I had to break through many times over. I had to really evaluate all these assumptions about what it meant to be a man.
Mm-hmm. And then figure out, where do you look for models of men doing it differently? Like who are your pioneers? Who are your role models for what it is to be different, like all the different ways it is to be a real man, to be an effective man, to be a connected man.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And like, there were none that I remember that I saw, because I was not tuned into that or asking those questions. But had there been, my very first assumption then, that's also part of the conditioning, is, well, if you're a guy like that, you must be gay.
Yeah.
And I don't want to be gay, so
yeah.
I'm going to push myself away. I'm not going to actually seek those kind of men out, because they're too, quote, feminine. They might look or act gay. That's all a big problem to my box I'm in. It's really thick.
Well, it's fascinating how sexism and homophobia, and all of them, racism, the whole, like, they all really, really intersect, right? So those are all, like, there's no way of having a conversation about the impact of, like, conditioning gender conditioning in a patriarchy without also talking about homophobia, without also talking about racism. Like, they're all in that mix.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's cool. As I'm listening to all this, I'm kind of getting, okay, we're all just born with the capacity to self-reflect. That's like a natural human, because of our brain and nervous system, like, we can actually do that. And then, but it's our conditioning that kind of takes us out of the willingness or the curiosity to go there and to utilize that skill that we have that could actually really help us socially in the world, in the intimate relationships, the one-on-ones, but also as communities. And, there's a lot where I think we're all thinking about in terms of the world at large right now and how we do relationships. So it's just cool to hear, like, I really feel like that's just in us. And then we can either be cultivating that or not. And I feel like largely as a society, that's not very overtly cultivated. It can be brought out through, the difficulties and challenges in life, which is one of their gifts. Or maybe you were lucky enough to grow up in a family where, people really asked or were curious about themselves and modeled that and showed how to do that. But largely, it seems like that's sort of a missing, it's an overtly missing piece. I don't know what you would say, because you're more in touch with young people right now than I am. I'm working with more adults. But
well, I love that part that you're saying. Like, it's so hopeful, this idea that we are naturally curious about ourselves and curious about each other. Like, that is our default setting. And stuff in life takes us out of that default setting. But in that way, it's not a learning process, it's a remembering process. It's just like a coming home process. I had the Family Institute, where we are right now, is working on pulling together this enormous project called the Encyclopedia of Couple and Family Therapy, and it has over 1,000 entries, and it's a really neat thing. So it's all different, like, tools and techniques and models, and then also kind of founders and thought leaders of the field. And so I just finished up writing Carol Gilligan's bio, who is like the mother of sort of psychology and gender. And so to kind of go back and look at her brilliance and what she was writing about, years ago, and that's her basic thing. It's like, when you listen to the voices of children, they are so true and so pure and unapologetic about their experiences. And what girls do is they separate from themselves, because our culture is patriarchal, and patriarchal isn't a blaming term, right? It's patriarchy is just a system that has different impacts on men, people in male bodies and people in female bodies, but it's a system that shapes all of our conditioning. And that girls get sort of taken out of, like, if you denigrate the feminine, then girls separate from their own voice, right? And that was her, like, seminal book, is In a Different Voice. And so girls learn to sort of mistrust their own voice and hedge and end their sentences with a question mark rather than just declaratively, this is my experience. And boys split, she feels like the process happens earlier, more like 4, 5, 6, that in order to become a boy, you have to separate from the feminine. You become, like, not feminine. And so that separation is not from self, but it's from feminine. If you separate from feminine, then you become, like, she coded for ways that little boys start to talk with a voice of authority around things that they don't need to be, there's no expectation that they should be an authority, but it's this idea that to be a boy, to be a man, to live in that trajectory is to speak with a voice of authority and to separate yourself from that which is feminine, and that there's a kind of inauthenticity that comes with that and a cost that comes with that. And it's just so like subtle and beautiful. And then by showing us kind of where we're going astray, it offers like a pathway home. Like, what if we did it differently? What if we just took boys, like helped boys just stay in their experience in all the ways that looks? Sadness, fear, shame, courage, joy, like all of that. And we helped girls rather than being like, no, you should, like, be nice or be this, or like, just what if you just were as you were?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's powerful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I haven't read her, but you're kind of waking that up in me.
Mm-hmm.
And we're talking, obviously, about relational self-awareness right now and sort of the maybe underpinnings of how we become how we are and who we are, and some of our behavior and our actions. And I'm curious, along those lines, how important is, you've talked about the generational piece, and just, I know you do this in your class, and just having students and adults you work with examine their history.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people have resistance to it, because it's like, well, I don't want to, that's done. It's over. Why do I need to do that? Not being aware that actually it's like in your actions every day, your history is. So will you say more about that generational piece of some of this conditioning?
Yeah. I can't imagine working with a client or with a student and not having that like big picture of sort of, tell me about the family that you grew up in. Like, tell me about what the system that was around you when you were a kid was. Like, it's just so essential to me that, of course, that's where we learn all those early messages. And the way I always say it is, like, when we're little, we're these little like social scientists, right? And we're like absorbing all these messages about emotion, about touch, about closeness and distance, about boundaries. Like, we just are absorbing it. And it's mostly all implicit learning. Sometimes there are explicit things when they say like girls don't, or don't do this or do, but a lot of times it's just really like implicit learning that we absorb. And so that lives in us. And I know people's resistance to looking at the impact of the past, I think it's a fear that I'm going to be seen as a victim, that I'm going to be seen as making excuses for why I am the way that I am. And it's never that. Like, it's never, none of us ask for the wounds that we have, and none of us are, we don't get to use those wounds as excuses or opt-outs, but they're there. Like, our conditioning, our wounds are there with us, and they are either like running the show if we're not aware of them, or if we're aware of them, then we can be savvy about when they're kind of getting stirred. And rather than being a victim or making excuses, like, that's so empowering to be like, aha, I know why the pair of glasses I have on that makes me perceive this situation in this way, I know where that comes from. That comes from a childhood in which blah, 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 blah. And that doesn't mean that I get to, have you be different. Like, don't do that because it's going to trigger my whatever. But it is that, okay, so now because I am, my whatever, fear of abandonment, my sense that I don't belong here is being stirred. Now I have a chance to work with that little self, that little part of me, and offer it what it didn't get, offer her what she didn't get when she was little. And it's this cool re-parenting process that's so super duper empowering. But I think that it's I don't know, people want to avoid it, or they don't want, there's different, I think, things that get in the way of that perspective, but it offers, first of all, avenues for self-compassion and empowerment, and it offers huge opportunities for empathy. Like, I think my most powerful tool as a clinician, as a couples therapist, is helping people reframe why your partner is acting the way they are right now, in the big picture of their story. My gosh, like, what more powerful avenue for empathy is there than like thinking about your partner as like a little 6-year-old, and that just opens that door for that. And again, it's not making an excuse for them, but it is like, aha, in the bigger context, I can see why you develop this way of relating to the world, defensively or, whatever.
Yeah, that's helped us a lot, I know, for years.
Yeah, and with that understanding, there's so many more options. It's like, I don't just have to react like you're doing this thing to me, if I understand why you're doing something and I have empathy for that, it just feels like it opens up all these other possibilities to be just more choices. How are we going to handle that? Versus like, go deal with yourself, or don't bring that here, or whatever might happen if it feels threatening to me, So it is a huge shift. I would say the same, that the more I can help people understand each other, but it's sort of like it's almost like the less I need to do for them, because it just starts to unfold differently and with more compassion, more humanity in a way.
Yes.
Yeah.
For sure. Right. I love that. And then it's like, I think so often as a couples therapist, it's easy to feel like there's a temptation, like the couple wants to argue the thing and then have me decide it somehow. Right. And that, first of all, I would never do it. Second of all, it wouldn't work. Right. Third of all, it's just so super boring. Like far more interesting is like, okay, so let's try out a new story of how it comes to be that you see this so differently. And like, let's get curious about each other's perspectives and, like creating helping the two of them become sort of a team that has some curiosity about how is it that everything from like your personality to your early childhood to your cultural conditioning shapes this moment. It's just so much more interesting than you were right and you were wrong.
Right.
Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. It's cool to hand that over to people and give them it's like a new paradigm. Yeah. And it is that relational self-awareness piece and you spoke to it as like being aware of oneself and then also what's happening here. And that I think it really does include all those layers. Like we have to become a more complex and creative person to be able to be in intimate relationship with someone else, because it requires more curiosity and more just different layers of understanding and putting it all together, integration, I think. So,
And I think part of when we think about like, okay, so why do people resist it? I think part of the resistance is living in a highly romantic culture. Like you don't, in romantic movies, romantic comedies, like you don't see them unpacking how the impact of childhood is shaping their experience of this moment. So somehow it feels super unromantic. But in some ways, like it's, oh my God, what could be more romantic than like having really cool wandering conversations about, wow, how does that fit with that? And, I think that's so romantic and but it's not what we're taught. We're taught like one definition of romance that doesn't include.
So limited.
Yeah, self-awareness or reflection. Like even today, driving around my old neighborhood, it was like new memories were coming up and I had all these feelings and emotions and it was cool. Like here we are, I've known you for so long and there's still all this new information to learn, like always about ourselves and even the ride down here, he was thinking about his childhood and my childhood homes and that it doesn't really end. It's not like I could know everything or he could about me.
Yeah, and had you like told me ahead of time that you were going to have an emotional response, for example, I wouldn't have known. So it was really sweet to see you be so impacted by visiting your childhood home. And that taught me something new right now about her. It's really sweet.
Right. Yeah.
Well, what it shows is that there's the couples who feel bored, stale. It's a lack of creativity. Like there's sort of a loss of creativity. It's not that you've mastered the other. It's just that there's maybe like a loss of curiosity, right? So, you guys, you had a new experience of each other, even though you've been together for years. Of course. That's so encouraging. But that's oftentimes what my students will name as a fear. Like they're afraid of getting bored. They're afraid of things getting stale.
Right.
Okay, so then don't. Stay super duper curious.
Right.
Forever a student, you're good.
Right. I think that's why I didn't want to get married. In my 20s, I wasn't interested, I told myself I wasn't interested in marriage because I think what I saw was not inspiring. I was like, I have way more fun with my boyfriend than I see like my married friends having. Like they seem to have just kind of gotten bored with each other or become roommates or something. And I don't ever want to be that. But I didn't have a language at the time for how else I would create a long-term relationship that was alive and interesting and engaging and fun for me. I didn't know. I thought marriage just kind of squashed it, but it's really, it isn't marriage at all. It's like, it is sort of deciding you know each other and there's nothing more to learn. And that's kind of deadening.
Uh-huh.
Hey, what's up, guys? Quick interruption here from the Relationship School. We have a free web class coming up here August 14th, and I want you to be there if you are with someone who is emotionally unavailable, like I used to be. All right, this is specifically a web class designed for people who are frustrated, feeling unmet and alone. Your partner is withdrawing, retreating, pulling away, not really wanting to talk to you. And obviously that's frustrating and uncomfortable and brings up anxiety and insecurity perhaps in you. So we're going to talk about how to deal with that, how to decide if this is the right relationship for you, and without really shutting the person down any further, okay? Because my guess is what you're doing isn't working. So I'm going to give you some awesome tips. This is a live class. You get to ask me whatever you want, and it's going to be very interactive, and I haven't done this specific webinar before, so I'm super pumped. Okay, so come join us, relationshipschool.net/August 14th. That's relationshipschool.net, August 1-4, all right? And that will be in the show notes if you just want to click on that and register. And we'll see you in there. Back to Alexandra.
I'm curious, Alexandra, what would be one tip a listener could do in terms of examining their history? Where does one start if they're new at that? Do they just go to therapy and hope that the person asks them the right questions, or is there something they can do on their own to investigate? Do they call their parents? Like, what would you suggest is like a place to start?
Yeah.
For a new person?
It's such a great question. I think there are lots of ways in. I mean, it sounds like a plug for Loving Bravely, but there's like tons of, like, that's the whole point of the Loving Bravely book that I wrote, is that it's like just sort of these different, I think of it as like dropping your awareness down in some different places and just seeing what's there. And so every place that I invite the reader to drop their awareness, forgiveness, apology, impact of gender messages, sex, like all these different places you just sort of bring your awareness to, and then reflect on how did the early messages in your life teach you that paradigm you have about apology, about sex, and then to what degree is that serving you, and to what degree is it constraining you?
Yeah.
And so I think that's really, so I that's why I was so like passionate about writing the book the way that I did, and including exercises. So each of the lessons has at the end some questions that you could journal about or ask the people who raised you about. I think that process is expansive and not done, but it's, I think that's one of the ways, any of these things, like listening to podcasts, like I think whatever puts you in a place of drawing your attention inward. Sometimes, I mean, I think people do it differently. Like some people like really enjoy like going on a run and doing that process. Mm-hmm. For some people, it is sitting in a therapist's office or doing a group, like sort of a therapy group, or like sort of trying out a few different things until you feel like you've found what clicks with you and gets you wondering.
Well, and a great place to start, I would recommend, is in your own partnership, right? Too, if you're in a partnership, to begin to ask those questions of your partner, like, where do you come from?
Yeah.
Tell me more about your family history. Tell me more about what the childhood home was like. Like,
I
want to understand why you act the way you act.
Well, and the thing that has to be guiding that always is total curiosity versus
not shaming.
Not like, like what? Or I think oftentimes we shore ourselves up by, like I think in our culture in general, we have a hard time seeing difference as fascinating, enriching, wonder. We take difference and we go like this.
Yes.
So oftentimes when I have partners who are talking about each other's families, it's like my family was better and yours was worse. Like we have such an urge to do like a hierarchical better, worse kind of a thing. So really like making sure that along this journey, there's just tons of resisting the urge to do a blame, to do like better, worse kind of a thing, you know? Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. But I love that idea. Like, tell me more, right? Like, what was kindergarten like for you? Like, there are all these questions that you may have been married for 30 years and have no idea what your spouse's, kindergarten experience was or first kiss was, all these sorts of like, help me understand, you.
Yeah. Yeah, and then you've asked some, I think it's the attachment inventory questions, some of those questions that you ask your clients.
Yes.
There's some intense questions, right? Like, when you got hurt, how were you attended to, or who was there for you? And then it starts to reveal, like, actually, no one was there, and I just went to books. Or it's like, oh, wow, okay. So there's so many, I guess, questions like that.
Yeah, again, it's curiosity, as you were saying, like genuine curiosity. And I don't know if I wonder what you would say, but I feel like with couples, even though, there's a tendency maybe to compare histories and whose was better, whose was worse. If you really look, there's just different strengths and weaknesses, different challenges. Like no two people get together that have such different backgrounds that they don't resonate on some level. So even though they might look really different, the experience each person had, there's a lot they can relate around often. And so it can take just a real commitment to being curious and really wanting to understand each other, and not just taking the facts or the sort of the story, the narrative just on its own, but more like, what was your kindergarten experience like? Like that was a great question, because that's really asking how the person felt and how they perceived things. Because that can be really different based on how we are individually.
Yeah. And along with that too is like a need to, when our partners give us like that, like access to a particular chapter of their story that we might not have otherwise known, to really commit to not ever using it later on than when we're, I think that's sometimes something that blocks vulnerable sharing is a fear that you may use it against me. Because maybe, and couples do that, and to kind of own, if and when we do that, to kind of own, like, my gosh, I don't want to be a person who would ever take something as special as that gift you gave me of telling me that story and use it against you. I am ashamed of myself. I want to do better. What do you need? How do we restore trust? Because that's a really big one, right? Is if what we say we want is closeness and intimacy, it needs to be coupled with a willingness to, when we get mad, really honor that for all of us. Like when we get mad and triggered, the really wise part of our brain, our prefrontal cortex, right, is poorly oxygenated. It is not online, and we are at risk of saying super shady McGrady things. And so I'm closing my mouth. I'm backing away slowly. Yeah, I love us too much to continue to speak right now. Like that's a practice, and it's such a worthy practice if what what we want is a kind of like relationship that can kind of be renewed again and again with curiosity, with closeness, with vulnerable sharing. It's not going to happen if
you just take it down and during one argument. Absolutely. Yeah, and I liked how you said, like, if we say what we want is this, then our actions have to follow through. You said something in the beginning, like, there's no pass for that. Like, just because I'm mad, I don't get to, or just because I had this certain injury or challenge, then I get to just check out here. Like, we don't really get to just do that to each other without having to take responsibility for the consequences of that. And, really, really forces us to grow up, to be in partnership, And
that process, right? Like that repair process. I wrote a whole chapter about like apology, and my husband was like cracking up. He's like, now tell me what you think you know about apology. Because in our marriage, I've had to learn that, like, if you roll your eyes, it doesn't count. If your hip is like jutted out to the side, like it doesn't. Like I've had to work on, like, what's my story? How did I see repair? How did I see repair happen in my family growing up? And what do I want my kids to see around that's a big one, because we aren't going to be, even if we're committed to practicing self-awareness, it doesn't mean that we're perfect at it. So there are times that stuff comes out and we don't like how we said it, or it was not handled with as much grace as it could have. And so are we fully able to kind of own an apology and repair process? Yeah. That's a big one.
I think your statement there about relational self-awareness doesn't mean we're perfect. Like, it doesn't mean it's a journey. I'm assuming you're talking about kind of forever, right? Will you, if I can ask you, can I ask you a couple of personal questions?
Yeah.
So you and your husband, like, how long have you guys been married?
It's going to be 20 years next month.
Nice. So in that 20 years, obviously there's been challenges, and what's, I'm curious what you two are working on, and like, is there a theme or a new area of growth, or how do you guys deal with conflict? Like, I'm just curious about how you guys do it that could benefit the listener.
Yeah.
After 20 years.
Oh my gosh. We went for a walk recently, and I was like, what do you think, like, how have we done it? Like, what do you think are and it was really fun to hear him talk about, friendship, I think, has always been our core, like, is we sort of were based on a friendship initially. And so that sense of being friends, and I don't know that I would have caught this quite the same way. Like, right now we're both in really intense chapters in our careers, like where we really are doing things we're passionate about. We work hard, we work long hours. We have teenage kids who are, really, like, it's just a different vibe in our home around, like, the boundaries and time together and time as a couple. And so we aren't probably doing as well as we could be doing around couple time. But he talked about, and I agree with this, like, ways in which we both give each other a lot of latitude around our careers, and like that's the point of connection, is checking in about what's going on in our careers, like supporting each other in that process. And that's a way that our friendship is manifesting now. And it's really different when we had little kids. I was mostly out of the workforce, and so it was a really different, like different ways that our connection manifested then. So I think then the conflict comes from when we are exhausted and depleted and irritable. Like, I don't know that there's a really big theme we're working on right now. I think there will be, like, as our kids, I think our next big developmental transition is launching kids, and the whole, like, reorganization that happens around launch, about having adults, kids, like, that's sort of on the horizon. But I'm like, la la la, like, fingers in my ears, I'm not listening.
That's sweet.
Yeah, I think I love you just speaking to the, like, we're vulnerable when we're depleted and exhausted and, irritable, like, those things, like, our physiology is so often, I feel like, what we're up against too. Like, if I'm stressed about something, it could have nothing to do with Jayson, but that can make me much less, I'm just going to perceive him differently. Things are going to sound different. I'm just in a state where, it just can be like, all of a sudden we're just like, oh God, what's happening? Like, and so it's almost like at any stage of life or a relationship, we're just vulnerable to the state of our body and all of that, and how that's just we have a responsibility there too, to sort of know, again, what's happening on that level and what we're dealing with inside that's going to make something just go really smoothly, or actually make something way more challenging than it needs to be. But then to repair and deal with that you still have to.
So. I feel like that cannot be emphasized enough. Like, that is such a huge point. And I think it's such a challenging point to bring our awareness, because when I am depleted and I feel annoyed with Todd, I literally, to my bones, get convinced that he is seriously so annoying. This is seriously like the hill I would die on. Like, this is an issue that I will go to the mat on. And then, like, however longer later, I'm like, oh, wait, I'm starving, I'm exhausted, but in the moment, it feels so that is I think that's such a powerful reminder about self-care, humility.
Humility, totally.
And an easy one to, like, I'm sort of shocked by my ways in which I can sort of miss that and underestimate and only see it in the rearview mirror. And I get frustrated about that. Like, why can't I do a better job of that at this point? After all of this therapy, being a therapist, reading a book, writing a book, all of that stuff. But that's a big one of the relationships. How am I taking care of myself? And if I'm not being kind to myself, I sure as heck am not going to be kind to you.
Bandwidth is going to shrink. And I feel like you often are he looks out for that for me sometimes, because I can kind of go like too long without some of the things that would nourish and replenish me, like sleep, like enough sleep or time alone. But I feel like Jayson often will catch that before I will. Like, hey, are you getting everything you need over there. And I feel like that's a place where we can help each other out, because we often spot it before the other person, I'll spot it in you sometimes, that you're stressed before he really realizes, oh, actually I am a little bristly and like something's building up in me. And I don't know, because it is hard to know. It can be hard to see ourselves.
And I love the question, if I notice something, how can I give you feedback in a way that's going to invite collaboration versus defensiveness?
Yes.
I love that question, because what works for me in terms of giving my husband feedback may not work for him, vice versa. So I think that's a great, because there are times we're going to notice it in our partners before we notice it in ourselves. And so how can I say it in a way that's where you're going to be able to lean into it instead of rolling your eyes, pushing me away, turning it back around. Well, yeah, but how about you? Whatever things we may do. And
totally.
Yeah. And I sometimes need to be aware that sometimes my curiosity about her is coming from self-preservation.
Danger.
It's not going to go well for me if she goes down. So, honey, what do you mean? I'm like trying to thwart this disconnect.
Yes.
Week. I'm like, no, I've got a big week coming up. We need to be strong here.
Yeah. How can I take care of you and also me?
Right. Because it's both of us.
Yeah, I mean, that's the complexity of a couple is that question right there. Take care of you and me and have us both do well. And win-win here, given all the crazy demands we got going on. Right?
Yeah. I was just working with a couple this morning, and she came in. I mean, she was so full of fire. Her litany of complaints about her man was so long. And it was, and he did a really beautiful job of staying present. So that was huge growth for them, as he stayed present. He stayed curious. He neither shamed her for being so critical, nor dissolved in a puddle. And eventually I found a way of kind of asking her a little bit more about what's going on, right? Tell me more about the context of your week. And, it turns out there's tons of, she's recovering from being sick. She's exhausted. They've been out every single night, on and on. There are tons of ways in which her bandwidth was shrunk down to nothing. And I was so impressed with her ability to just go, oh, when she, 5 minutes before, she was like, I am done with this whole thing.
It is impressive when someone can, be self-reflective and humble and not have to be right, because it can so undermine a relationship to have to be right, versus trying to, let's get a shared understanding of what's happening for both of us here. Probably there's truth to all of it, probably. Which is going to be way more productive.
Well, sometimes I think what gets in the way is, okay, if we agree that I'm bristly because of these things that have to do with sleep, stress, my story of myself, it doesn't equal that then my concerns are not valid. Right. So both those things can be true. I think sometimes the resistance to the humility, the owning it, is that then you're going to think, And so both those, both those things can be true. So I think that sometimes is another point of resistance that we can bump into.
Yeah. So I want to just transition as we wind down to asking you a few questions about just, what you're noticing out there in the relationship streets. Both with your couples, I mean, there's a lot going on in the world. There's seems like a heightened level of stress and fear. And just, people are, kind of on edge, it seems like to me. And I'm curious if you're noticing that in young people in your classroom this last semester maybe, or if you're seeing that in couples. And what are some of the themes that you notice right now relationally that people are there themes, or is it just sort of the standard, people don't know how to do conflict and they struggle to take responsibility?
Yeah. Well, I do think that the level is amped up to 1,000. I just did a interview with Chicago Tribune about sort of taking care of yourself during this really emotional time, especially around, it was about the family separation at the border. And I think that's how do we kind of stay in what's good and beautiful in our own lives, and knowing that there's so much desperation and suffering around us. And that was it was the hardest interview. I mean, I've done so many interviews at this point. It was the hardest interview because I think in part because it stirs me, like so many people, I was, in my bed sobbing, listening to, just the reports and the sounds of, children screaming for their parents. Like, it's just horrific. I think, just horror. Yeah. And that it is political, but it's also about just who are we? Like, what are we moving towards? And ways in which fear, like, we're making, the only two choices really are fear and love when you boil it all down. And when we're in that energy of fear, it's just really hard and it's really draining. So I think I noticed that just my own ability to be productive, like I am less productive now. Like, I sort of have to shrink myself down because I am so stirred so much of the time. So aware of my privilege. I'm so aware of my privilege. The privilege to turn off the TV, to look away for a while. Yeah. There's a privilege in that Absolutely. I think we all need to reconcile and figure out, okay, so what do I do with my privilege? That's what I see with my college students. They are so aware. They're so, like, their ability to talk intersectionally about race, privilege, sexuality, religion, socioeconomic status, like authority. They are, I learn from them every day. Like, I have 2 gender studies degrees. Like, I feel like I'm so woke, like I'm so right there on the edge. And my students challenge me all the time around ways in which they construct this stuff so differently and really fluidly, and they serve as advocates and allies for each other in a way that's really cool to see. So in those moments, I feel really inspired and encouraged, and I'm willing to, like, I have a lot of wisdom and experience, but I am really willing to put it here so that I can make a lot of space for their wisdom and their truth and their ways of putting things together that's different than what was possible for me. And it's cool because they oftentimes will say things like, we can do this because we were taught. Like, they see oftentimes, like, the lineage, like, that they didn't get here without the civil rights movement, without family, like, all these things that sort of led them to, like, my young women who are like, we can do this stuff because we were raised by moms who told us we could do this stuff, and dads who told us we can do this stuff. So they get that they're connected also to an entire lineage, and that their courage and their ability to be advocates and allies is because of where they come from, which is cool to see. I see a lot of, like, fear, like, fear of relationship, just fear of getting it wrong, fear of getting hurt, not trusting themselves to be able to stand up again if they get hurt. Yeah. I think that's I think maybe it's because people's buckets are full and they feel kind of raw, and so then to have one more, to put themselves in a place of risking getting hurt in relationships maybe feels like a bridge too far. Mm-hmm. That's maybe one theme also.
Yeah, thanks for naming all the complexities going on. Yes. So as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking, wow, with all that's going on, it seems to me more valuable than ever to learn how to do relationship well. Mm-hmm. Because it's like, we're in this together, and if I don't know how to work it out with you, like, I certainly can't help the world work it out there. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious if students also see that or have that awareness that how maybe important it is to learn how to do this stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. I know there are times that I go through my own process of, like, I'm not doing enough out there and I should be doing more, and what does my activism look like? And there are ways that like helping people in that one-on-one way with their relationship with themselves and with each other, not just romantic relationships, but all, like you're saying, all relationships. Like, that is such a starting point, and helping, I feel like so much of what we do is helping people to have shades of gray, to tolerate shades of gray, to sit in mystery, to sit in paradox, to sit in a place where there aren't easy, obvious answers, and to hold complexity. So then when I think about that is exactly what we need. Like, there's ways in which our politics, like, seduces us into, it's either this or this. Right. No. Right. There's so many shades of gray, and there's so much, like, I'm going to go in your shoes and you go in my shoes, and that's what we do. That's what we're committed to one-on-one, and that's what kind of has to happen right up at every level. Yeah. So then I'm like, oh, this is actually the most important thing, is doing relationship well. Mm-hmm.
It is. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love it. I mean, there's just so many ways to show up and serve right now. That's what I keep thinking, like even, I was saying this earlier today, even, because sometimes I'm just home with my kids and I'm not really focused out in the world, but I do really see that as very connected to contributing to the world, because our family and how our kids' world is going is going to definitely influence what they do in the world and how they show up in the world. And so there's many ways to be engaged and involved, and there's probably always more ways we could be, especially given our privilege. And but figuring out what our gifts are, and for everyone to be thinking of that, what's my particular way to contribute? Because there's definitely plenty of room. Yeah.
And I just want to underscore just the ability to work out differences is, to me, like a superpower in the world right now to have, and to continue to learn how to do that at home is huge. And then out in the world is even more awesome, because it's so needed right now.
It's so needed. And the ability to say, wait, tell me how you heard me say that, and help me understand how I'm coming across to you right now, and being curious about what's the impact that my presence is having. I mean, we have a president who is the antithesis of self-awareness, right? Who models, like, we never had the opportunity to see him say, you know what, I don't like how I said that. I'd like to try again. Or tell me how you experienced me coming across. Let me say that differently then. Or I'm sorry I got that wrong. Those are all just really foundational tools of self-awareness that makes our work more important. We don't. There's no top-down model right now. So we are the models for how do you kind of get curious about how you're coming across and how you're being experienced. And is that how you want to be experienced? And if not, then how are you going to modify it to be more effective or more connected?
Yeah, it's like I have this vision of like planting those types of people all over society, just like little plants.
Yeah.
And they just like are infused with that ability, that capacity, and then what an impact it has on the store, or that little park scene, or the playground scene, or what's going on, at home. So again, just to the listener, I just want to encourage you to keep developing that muscle.
Yeah.
Everything you just said. Oh, I'm sorry I got that wrong. Or, what was it that I was saying that led you to believe that? Just that curiosity is so big. Well, cool. I know you're working on another book. And you have other exciting projects. Is there anything you want to share about kind of what you're up to right now and where you're going?
That's really, I'm back in that really fun, grounded space of writing, and it's early, so the book won't come out until February of 2020. But it's a book specifically for women and sort of feminine presenting people around how do you understand your sexuality, and what is sexual self-awareness, and how do we think about and feel about who the sexual self, like what is a sexual self and how did it come to be, and just discerning those outside in messages about who should I be and how should I be, and then kind of figuring out what does a more inside out expression of my sexual self look like. And it's like really fun to work with ideas of like radical self-compassion, radical self-acceptance, looking at this as a developmental story across time. So that's really what I'm in the throes of now. But I've got, different cool teaching things coming up and speaking stuff. So there's always stuff cooking.
Yeah, it's super exciting. That's cool. And you're one of our ambassadors here at the Relationship School. So thanks again for just being a person out there that we can look to for guidance and wisdom. And I want to, as you know, we're going into schools now, and I want to just get a little more time with you outside of this too. We talked a little bit about it, Ellen and I, with you before this recording. What we're finding with young people, and just continue to how to steer this. So any of your guidance would be appreciated.
I'm just so grateful for what you guys are up to, and it's such a needed mission, and it's a mission that you guys are doing well, and like with a lot of integrity and care. Like it's not thrown together, it's not haphazard. Like you guys are you really have been cultivating something that is full of integrity and care. And I love that. And I have been really proud and pleased to, to work with you. And I look forward to doing so in an ongoing way, for sure.
Cool. And I'm looking forward to that book. Sounds really juicy. And where can people find you? Just remind us about how.
Yeah, I mean, the best way is just through my website, which is dralexandrasolomon.com. And to be, I have like a monthly newsletter. It's as monthly as possible when it's like when I'm able to get it together. But that's how I keep people posted on what's going on and any sort of like articles and teaching things that are coming up. So that's really the easiest way, is through the website and then the newsletter. And I'm, of course, on Facebook and Instagram as well. And all that is easy to find through the website.
Great. And we'll include those in the show notes. Okay.
Thank you. Thanks for having us and for just being a resource in the way that you are. And it's just a privilege to get to meet with you today.
Good.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah, agreed. And I just love the way you speak and how you're speaking from a lot of different angles, given your gender studies and intersectionality and just all these different ways you can come at this, all the challenges we face relationally. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Okay, beautiful. Thanks for your patience with the sound, guys, and hopefully you got something out of that. Go check out Alexandra, as always. Get her book, Loving Bravely, and she's got some great articles on her blog as well. Okay, it's dralexandrasolomon.com. Action step. So we talked about gender, we talked about self-awareness, relational self-awareness, self-reflection, and certainly self-care. Like, how do we take care of ourselves so that we're not just reacting from a tired, hungry place with our partner? So there's a lot we could direct you toward right now, but I think one simple step you can do is, well, let's call it 2 steps. Number 1 is self-reflect on, is your reactivity tied to your lack of sleep, your hunger, other stressors going on in your life, so that you're actually more on edge and more irritable? And is that contributing to your relationship? So that's step 1, is to self-reflect. And then step 2 is to call yourself forward, call yourself out with someone you love. Ideally your partner, if you're partnered, if you're single, with a close friend, and just say, hey, I notice that my reactivity has a lot to do with how I'm doing that day, or what I ate, or how I slept, or my stress at work. Just as a way to, like, if I'm listening to that and I'm your partner or friend, I'm going to relax a little bit and not take it so personal, right? Because have you noticed this? You're just going to be more reactive when you're under-resourced and you're not as sharp, you're not as on your game, and you're more easily triggered, and you're just more sensitive usually, right? I know it is certainly true for me. And we talked a little bit about that there at the end. So do that, all right? And as always, I'm psyched you're here. Make sure you join the Smart Couple Facebook group. Go into your Facebook browser and just type in Smart Couple Group, and it'll take you right to us. Ask to join, you got to answer a couple questions, and we'll likely admit you. And there's a ton of great support, and it's a like-minded, growth-oriented community that's all about relationship, all right? Seeing relationship as a major force in our lives for good and for healing and for having the kind of life we want and being able to tackle the obstacles that a lot of us are facing. You notice this, when we have people close at our side, we tend to do better facing those challenges. So join our Smart Couple Facebook group, all right? Okay, everybody, thanks again for listening, and we'll talk very soon.